Good morning and welcome back now to the reading of God's Word. Last week, you finished up with the book of Daniel, which finished up the four major prophets. That was a lot of reading. There's a lot of information in there, and it takes a long time to read those and to try to absorb everything is in there. So this week we begin with the minor prophets, but don't let that word minor get you swayed into thinking that these are just small books. These are minor prophets in that they're not quite as long as the majors, but yet the analogy here is they do carry a big stick. And the big stick, of course, is God's word. He's still giving warnings of their sinfulness. This would be both to Judah and to Israel at this time, is what we're looking at. Their sinfulness, and then his promise of a punishment, also the execution of that punishment, but then a promise of restoration, and that restoration would come way down the road in the millennial reign of Christ. So we will see a lot of this throughout these minor prophets. So with that, we go ahead into first, we're going to look this week into the first four of the minor prophets, and that being Hosea, Joel, Amos, and Obadiah. Now, as we look into this, not all of the prophets are against Judah necessarily. We're going to look this week at Hosea and Amos, and they are prophesying against the northern kingdom of Israel. Joel really doesn't get into who he's against, yet he's against everybody. He says all the people of the land. So we'll look at that. And then Obadiah looks directly at Edom, which is the brother of, it would be Esau, the brother of Jacob. So we'll get into that at the end of this week. So looking at that, going to Hosea first. And Hosea, God uses Hosea to give an illustration right up front. Here we get into chapters 1 through 3. Hosea's illustration of how God deals with Israel. And Israel is, then we're talking about the northern kingdom here at this point. Israel sometimes refers to the northern kingdom. At other times it refers to all of Israel as it was under the reign of King David, which would be the entire 12 tribes. So here we go with, first of all, Hosea is given the command to take a wife of harlotry or an adulteress. And so he gets Gomer. Now, these first three chapters are all about this wife, Gomer, who is going to be going astray. It is the illustration that God gives Israel about their actions towards God, how they break the covenant with God, just like Gomer would break the covenant of marriage with Hosea. And Gomer goes off and she winds up eventually having three children. God names these three children through Hosea. First, she has a son, and he's named Jezreel, which has to do with the valley. This is a valley of where evil had taken place. There's a lot about valleys, by the way. Valley of Jehoshaphat, Valley of Jezreel, Valley of Decision. And remember that valleys are always a place that are a low place between two mountains. And spiritually speaking, you got two mountains who are high spots in your spiritual life. The valleys are, of course, the low parts. So when you see valley of, it usually means something at a low point. So he gets these three. There's two sons and a daughter. The two sons, first one is Jezreel, which means God sows. In other words, God had planted Israel to start with, and he has done, taken care of them for the longest time. Then she comes after that. She has a daughter, Lo Ruhamah, which means unpitied, and this is the plight of Israel. And then there's a third one. There's a son named Lo Ami, which means not my people. And this, of course, is Israel breaking the covenant with God. So he gives these examples through these three children and their names. So in chapter 2, we get that, and we're all in chapters 1 through 3 here. So in chapter 2, verses 1 through 13, God discusses the punishment of Gomer and in the punishment of Israel. These two are synonymous here. You know that it is an illustration of what's going to happen. But yet, right after that punishment, he turns right around in verses 14 through 23, and he gives the promise of restoration. And we're going to see, and we've already seen the promise of restoration in all the four major prophets, and we are going to see it again in the minor prophets. They are talking about that time in the end when the Messiah comes to reign eventually. Part of this may have to do, of course, with the return after the 70 years of exile, but by and large, most of this is after the tribulation period and the reign of Christ in the millennium. So he does that in chapter 2. In chapter 3, we kind of come to the end here of this example of the harlot, where Hosea is told to buy back Gomer. And Gomer has gone her way. She's done what she's going to do, and she's been the harlot. But he in turn loves her enough. God tells Hosea, go back and buy her back, and he does. And then he kind of puts her in a restriction and says, you will no longer play the harlot. This is representative of God going back after Israel in a day in the future, and he is going to reclaim them, both after the first exile, but also, and more importantly, the entire nation of Israel after the tribulation period. So we're in a dual issue right here as far as these prophecies are concerned. In chapters 4 through 7 in Hosea, God identifies his people as the prodigal. And of course, Jesus gives the example of the prodigal son. And so we talk about that. This is that son that turned away or left, went their way, and really insulted God by doing such a thing. The son, of course, in the parable was really insulting to the father. Yet the father loved the son. So we get this same analogy here. So in chapter 4, verse 6, and this comes down to the root cause of all of this. And he says, in chapter 4, verse 6, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. And this is directly aimed at the priest. The priests are supposed to be teaching God's laws to the people, yet they are examples of injustice. They are an example of greed. They are an example of mistreating the poor. They're just very self-centered, and yet this is causing, they are destroyed by lack of knowledge. In other words, the priests are here the ones, the guilty ones. And in chapter 5, God announces their guilt and his rejection of it. Chapter 5, verse 15, he says, I will go away and return to my place until they acknowledge their guilt and seek my face. And this is interesting because over in Amos too, when we get there, Amos chapter 8 in verse 11, it says, behold, days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will send a famine on the land, not a famine for bread or a thirst for water, but rather for hearing the words of God. So in this, we see here that I'm going to go away. In other words, there'll be a time. And what we get to eventually, if you go way off now, if we get to Malachi, after that, you see the 400 years, what's called the silent years, and you don't see any of the prophecies coming up. This all fits together in a way that when you take all of this in under one large umbrella of prophecy, so much of it fits. So we have to pay attention to it and keep it in its context. So God will go away and will not be with them until they acknowledge their guilt. Then in chapter 6, Israel thinks God would not do such a thing. And they say, oh, he'll restore us in 2 or 3 days. He's really not going to punish us all that much. But God turns around and it says in verse 6, I delight in loyalty rather than sacrifice. In other words, they're thinking they can sacrifice their way out of getting into trouble with God. But God has always wanted obedience. He has never wanted them to have to go and make restitution for the sins that they were committing. So in chapter 7, God goes through a long laundry list here of the crimes of Israel. And as you read through that, you can just get that flavor of what God is seeing there. We call God sometimes Elroy, Elroi. And this is the God who sees the hearts of men. So God sees the crimes of Israel as well. He sees this, and they're not going to hide from him. He knows exactly what they're doing. And then in chapters 8 through 10 is the prophecy of the judgment and what the judgment will look like. It gets to be pretty descriptive. God shows them already. He says, I've shown you, I have done everything. I have planted you. I have done everything I can for you, and yet you have turned to other gods, and this goes back to the harlotry, the idolatry of Gomer. Gomer kind of comes back into play right here. God showing them that he took care of them, he married them, he was the husband to them, and yet this is what they did, and he's calling their hands on it. And in chapter 11, the big thing happens here. God shows his love and loyalty in verses 1 through 4. However, in verse 5, it is very, very explicit that you will go into exile into Assyria. So it is, and there's no mistaking what God intends to do here as far as his judgment is concerned. Then we get into chapters 11 through 13, and God continues with his indictments, his declaration of judgment that is coming. God also continues to explain to them about his love for them and raising them up from a youth. He goes all the way back to, and I took you out of Egypt and raised you up. He planned for them, raised them up, protected them, cared for them. He blessed their land and made them fruitful. He defeated all of the enemies ahead of them. Even when they first said, though, when they got down here, go back to 1 Samuel, and the people decided, we want a king. And this is where things began to fall apart because they refused God as being a king. And then when they got into the kingdoms, already, we had the first kings, Saul, David, and Solomon. And after that, it went downhill with Jeroboam and Rehoboam. So this was very disappointing to God, but yet even through that, God stayed with them for the longest time, and he kept warning them, and he kept sending the prophets, and they kept killing the prophets, and Jesus talked about it, and there's parables about sending the prophets. When the guy that owned the vineyard, remember, kept sending his slaves back to receive the produce of the vineyard. They kept killing the messengers, and he decided, I will send my son, and yet they killed his son as well. So you know that problem, you know that parable. So here now God is talking about he sent all the prophets back, and he's told them, yet they refused it. And then we come to the end here where we have in chapter 14, the end of the book here, and this is where we get the promise of restoration, that they will no longer rely on any other nation but God alone. And this looks all the way into the millennial reign. This is where God eventually puts the two nations, Judah and Israel, back together. They're all one nation. They're going to be in the millennial reign. Christ is going to be there, and everything is going to go back to the way it should be. So there's a lot of reading here in this book of Hosea. This is the first 2 days reading of this week, and it's pretty full. So I hope that you will pray that you will get something out of it, and that whatever it is you read, always make sure there's something in there that you find that you can apply to your own life as it deals with sin, punishment, restoration. So that's where we're going. And with that now, may God bless the reading of his word.